Dave Myers, Spring, Alberta. Hi, Jennifer.
Jackie Cool from swimming.
Christina Pausch from the Life Saving Society.
Awesome. Hey, so online, you just want to put in the chat box your organization and your name. I'll be able to read those out. Russ Mendonca from Wrestling, Marvin Dobish from Alberta Sport Connection, Denise Fisher from Rope Skipping Alberta, Leah Weens, she's with ASC and Sport for Life, Joni Bitten from Be Fit for Life Center, Northwest. Yeah, so excellent group we have here today. Of course, I'll be recording the session as many people have conveyed that they're busy today and they're going to view it later. As well as we have our Women in Sport program, leadership program happening right now. They have a webinar. So, yeah, lots of things happening in the PSO world. So, thanks for joining. Maybe, Jen, can you hear us? Hi, Jen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. That's fantastic.
Super.
Awesome. So thanks again for the webinar on the 15th. I was really amazed by some of the numbers and the studies you guys have put forward. Probably, for me, the collegiate piece to that, where 32% of athletes identified to something other than heterosexual. I think that is it's a wake up call for everybody involved. So amazing work you guys are doing on that front.
Thank you, and we're excited. Guylain's doing the qualitative follow-up interviews, and so we'll continue to share that information as it becomes available. But it's the most comprehensive study, and EGAL is also redoing their high school survey this year, so we're hoping to have results. There'll be 4 or 5 questions on the sport and phys ed aspect of that. So we're looking forward to getting that research as well. So it's an exciting time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Great. So I guess I'll start off with the first question to get the ball rolling. But if you do have a question, feel free just to put it in the chat box, and we'll get there. We'll get your question answered. Does that sound good? All right. So I guess my first question is. If a sport organization doesn't have any gender data already, and they don't really understand the identity within their sport, how do I go about asking those questions in a respectful way of collecting the data of a person within my sport organization?
Well, the first thing that I'll say is that when we talk about collecting this kind of information, there's a couple of different layers to it. And so one of the things that you should be looking at is, as a good practice, removing, when you ask someone about their sex, replacing that with gender. So that is the more current, up-to-date term to use. So sex refers to biological, physiological characteristics that we have. Gender is the more current and modern term, which reflects how we identify. So when we're looking at asking those questions on a form, for example, a registration form, male and female as your gender are 2 of the categories. Should you wish to also be more welcoming, you may want to include a 3rd category, which is gender queer / non-conforming. And what that allows is for an individual who does not identify as either male or female to be able to self-disclose that. The other option that should go with that is prefer not to disclose. So those are the best practice categories. So remove sex, ask about gender, and then have male, female, gender, queer, non-conforming / non-conforming, and prefer not to disclose. That will allow you to, so then you say, well, what do I do if someone says that they're gender queer non-conforming, right? Well, that person will choose to participate in your sport based on how they feel comfortable. So that it's not up for you to say, well, choose male or female. That individual has shared something that's, one, very confidential potentially, and two, they will self-select into how they participate into your sport. And it doesn't become problematic at all unless you start to get into those higher levels where there may be some restrictions in terms of males and females on your team, and how do you identify, and are you someone who in the past may have transitioned to a new gender. So the short answer is male, female, gender queer, non-conforming, or prefer not to disclose. If you're going to ask that question, you have to be very careful that you are going to be able to keep that information in confidence. So for someone who's cisgender like myself, I'm tick off female, and I'm quite comfortable with everybody knowing that. Let's say someone who puts down I'm gender queer non-conforming, how might other people react to that if that information was made public? Don't use your male female gender identity as a means of identifying people who are trans. That's not the route to go. People who are trans will self-identify if and when they feel that it is appropriate for them to do so. So they will have a lot of concern about how that information will be treated and kept in confidence, and and any pushback potentially from the organization. So the membership form is not the way in which you're going to get that information. The membership form is for basic information.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, just Jennifer, it's Dave from Ringette. Why would we need to know if someone is transgender? Just a follow-up to your point.
Yes, you don't. Unless there are competitive policies in place that affect that person's ability to participate. And what we know is that it really doesn't have an effect until we quite often get to the international level. And only for certainly quite often is the case, women who have transitioned from being a male and are now females. So it shouldn't matter, and so you shouldn't need to say who's trans, who's not, who's cisgender, who's not. It should be something that your organization sort of welcomes as this person is a new member. How do they identify? That's great. When you get into higher levels of international sport, for example, the Olympics, they have a more, the IOC and some of the IFs have more restrictive policies.
Okay, so
Ringette Canada. So I'll just finish off. So Ringette Canada, Dave, as you know, has a gender inclusion policy, which basically says players are welcome to play in the gender in which they identify. So in the case of Ringette, on the women's national team for Ringette, if you identify as a woman, that's sufficient.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions from the group? Okay, maybe I'll move on with my next question. So a lot of us in the room are in basically in staff positions within provincial sport organizations. How could I help my board um, or other leaders to feel better equipped to talk about LGBTQ I2S inclusion? Where would you turn a leader like us to for like resources regarding language and speaking appropriately?
Absolutely. I would, uh, and not just because I've been involved in writing them, but I would start, because they're sport specific, I would start with the cause Leading the Way resource, which was revised in 2017 and reflects the Canadian experience and the Canadian voices of LGBTQI2S and athletes and coaches. And so I would encourage you. It's not a hard read, but contextualizes it within Canadian sport, and it includes the T as in transgender, but also for the trans inclusion, the CCES's guidance on trans inclusion for sport organizations in Canada, again is a very important document and has terminology in there as well, as does the cause document. If you're looking, so that's a starting point, and I'd also encourage you to, in addition to that, invite LGBTQ athletes to come into to speak to your board. So, for example, out west we have quite an active You Can Play regional organization, and we have Dr. William Bradell at the University of Calgary, and we have Chris Wells at the University of Edmonton with the Alberta Institute for Sexual and Gender Minorities. So you in Alberta have some really, really, really good resources there, locally, and so it's one thing to read the documents. It's another thing to have someone who identifies as LGBTQI2S as an individual come and talk about that. And it's interesting too. It certainly is. There are more athletes and coaches who identify as lesbian and gay and bisexual that you can access through You Can Play. But when I was out there for the COC summit, there was also an amazing woman I met, and I'll follow up because I have her card. Who introduced me herself to me as an out trans, official in her sport, and so here's someone who is, has lived experience as a trans woman. In sport that volunteered to be a resource. So Aaron, I can send you that to individual's name, but you have lots of local resources that you can pull in and have those, because it's nothing, as you know, hearing an athlete's voice or someone who has that lived experience is tremendously powerful for sport organizations and boards.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, certainly pass that along. There'll certainly be resources. So, one question from the chat box, and it is from Marvin Dobish at Alberta Sport Connection. And he's asking, what is the latest update with respect to the COC tools that they preliminary shared with those in attendance at the COC Inclusion Workshop back in November in Calgary?
Marvin, hi. Great to hear from you. And yes, the tools. I was talking to Rosa Kassar at COC just the other day about these tools, and with the Pyeongchang Games, everything's pushed back a little bit, as you can well understand. And so we're looking probably for an mid-April, late April date for the launch of the online resource. So stay tuned on that. So not too long. So hang in there. But we're excited to have that resource coming out in the next 2 months, hopefully.
Fantastic.
Oh, just to take a quick step back, where can I find the Cause Leading the Way resource that you mentioned?
So if you go to the cause website and go to the LGBTQI2S inclusion and sport pages, you'll find it right there. There's an executive summary as well as a longer version, and it's available in both French and English for downloading. The CCS Creating Inclusive Environments for Trans Participants in Canadian Sport is available on their website as well. Again, downloadable in English and French. The other resource that's coming out soon, I'm just looking at a close to a final version that I've been working with Megan Cummings at CCS, is a policy and practice template for sport organizations on creating a good trans inclusion policy. So, and what it does is in a more applied way provide sport organizations guidance with how to develop a good policy, and so what are the different sections included in that. So for example, we talk about having a section that is a commitment to diversity inclusion. So what does that look like? Why would you have it in your document, and what would be a sample statement? And so it walks you through in terms of the different aspects. So should you have a definition? What should you have when you look at the application or scope? Um, what should you have around using chosen names and pronouns, safeguarding an individual's right to privacy and confidentiality, sample statements, for example, and background on use of toilets, change rooms, and other facilities. So quite a lot of good information, and you can take those sample statements and decide which ones are applicable, and then you can refine and revise them for your own organizations. But it was something that people asked about and said the CCS resource was great, but now I need to come up with a policy. What can I have? So this should be out hopefully in the next month or 6 weeks as well, in both official languages.
Excellent. So things that we can do to enhance that welcoming culture of an organization.
Exactly.
I get there's a question from Jody. Is there a location where a parent can find which sports have a good inclusive policy in place for youth?
No.
Okay, so I guess
what we do have is we have Chris Mosier who has the transathlete.com site, and Chris Mosier, some of you may recognize Chris. Chris is a real trailblazer and identifies as a trans athlete, and is a triathlete, a master's triathlete, and he's also with You Can Play. So he has come, for example, and spoken to different conferences around inclusion. So what Chris has on his website is trans policies, and he asterisks the best practice ones, and so and these are from both the US and to a lesser degree Canada. Now CCS is asking for organizations to share with them their trans policies, and in this guidance document we identify a couple which we feel are best practices. So once that comes out, you'll be able to take a look at that and go and take a look at those policies. There's an assumption that if you're thinking about these things, and not only when it comes to trans inclusion, but gays and lesbians. So when we look at sexual orientation as well as gender identity, organizations that have inclusion policies that are thinking about and having these conversations and trying to create those respective environments. We know a policy itself is not sufficient, but it usually is a catalyst for conversations and action plans to go into implementing that policy.
I was fortunate to hear Chris speak at Sport Leadership Conference. He's an amazing individual and certainly a trailblazer like you described. When we talk about that, when we talk about policies and things that we need to do, in your mind, are there things that we currently do that maybe we don't understand that isn't promoting a welcoming culture? I know that can be a big question, but if there were some things that we do that maybe we don't really understand, that it doesn't provide that welcoming culture for the community, could you identify any of those things that we could do that we don't realize that we are doing?
Well, I think when we look at the language we use and the in whether or not it's gender affirming language and gender inclusive language. So, give you an example. One of the athletes that we've worked with, and Anastasia, she said, I was really worried about, again, an Albertan athlete, so and one of your resources locally. Anastasia said, I was really worried when I came out what my sponsors would think and whether or not there would be any pushback around that. She said, but so when I heard my sponsor say to me, and do you have anyone special in your life, a guy or a gal? She said right away I knew that the possibility was there, that this was okay for me to be to that person had not made any assumptions and was fine with whatever response I gave. So I think that when we translate it into sort of our everyday lives, there's a lot of assumptions about and the language you use around what we call hetero normativity, which is the assumption that everyone is, and some would say should be, heterosexual. And so when we talk about, I'm on a women's dragon boat team, so when we have an invitation, we say, please bring your husbands, wives, partners, right? So, um, 5, 10 years ago, it might have been the assumption everyone's heterosexual, just bring your husbands, right? Or your boyfriends. So we're being very intentional in our language and not making assumptions that everyone on that team is heterosexual. So we're saying everybody's welcome, your husbands, your partners, your boyfriends, your girlfriends, come. And so we use a lot of assumptions in the language that we use. So that would probably be one of the things that I would look at. The second is when you hear language that is, homophobic and disrespectful. To address that. So that's part of being the ally, and so what they call casual homophobia, which it's not casual if you're the one that's on the receiving end. So when you hear a coach saying, don't be a sissy to the men or the boys, when hear don't play like a girl, those kinds of sexist comments that are quite common, to be able to address those in a way that says, that's disrespectful to girls and women, and that's not appropriate. So you're dealing with both, homophobic language and sexist language, and that kind of language is used to demean and make men feel less masculine, and is quite often used as a motivating kind of tough guy thing. So we need to, and it's not only the men that use it, women use it too. So we have to be really mindful of when we hear language that's disrespectful or inappropriate. And sometimes it's done, innocently enough, but we still need to address it and stop that. I think it's tougher when we look at the social media results. But, again, having conversations with your athletes, especially your high profile athletes, and around, use of social media, and, and have some training in there around, inappropriate, making sure you use respectful language. And, tying back to that, I would encourage you to, and I'm not sure I had it in the I did have it in the webinar, but the one thing that I would share with your board as part of your training or exposure is take them to the live No Homophobe, and just sort of say, this is what's out there. This is what our athletes who identify as LGBTQI2S face on the online, and as well as offline in their everyday conversations, because that's a real eye opener. I mean, it was for me. Ooh.
Absolutely. No.
Jen, can you repeat that?
Can you repeat the live no homophobe?
Yes,
That reverse?
www.nohomophobes.com.
Nohomophobes.com. Okay. Great. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering how we can support our members right at the team level to have these conversations about inclusion. what can we?
Sorry, I just missed the first part of that. Could you repeat
Sorry,
that?
yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations for us on how we can support our members having conversations about inclusion right down at the team level.
So like a team
Okay.
leader or
Yeah, like
yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the things is you don't have to, and in the cause leading the way resource, we talk about this, is you don't have to say, okay, now we're going to talk about LGBTQI2S inclusion. But what you can do is as part of, because I think every coach has the conversation. Every team leader has that conversation around, this is, we want to create a team and we want to, respect each other and be respectful, that kind of thing. But so when you're having that conversation, when your coaches are having that conversation, it's really important that identify sort of the differences that are important that we respect. So for example, if you sort of say, okay team, we've got lots of different kinds of people here, right? But you don't actually sort of talk about the different kinds. The people won't hear and may not learn. So say, we've got, people from different backgrounds, people have come from different places, we have, people different sexual orientations, and genders and 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 you name it, right? And ethnicity. And so it's part of the making it explicit, and we need to be respectful of all those differences, and we all need to work together, as a team. So those are the things that are really important, because if I'm an LGBTQI2S athlete, I'm listening for those, am I being identified as part of this team? And you don't have to have an athlete, who's out, or to have those conversations. Just assume that they're there. They may come out to you, they may not, and if they're not there, they may, be there next year. But if they're not there, they may have two moms, they may have two dads, they may have a sister or a brother who's gay, that kind of thing. So it's very rare these days that you don't have someone within your, immediate family, or extended family that isn't doesn't identify as a sexual or gender minority. So be really explicit when you do that sort of, respecting differences.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Um, Jen, if you look at, some of the what's happening in the space, what would you say right now is I know we always want to do rankings into the sport world or whatnot, but who is that best in class organization that, if as our organization, who do we want to aspire to be in Canada right now? Can you identify, would you be able to identify one?
Not well. I should say. I mean, I would like to say that the two organizations that we're working with, Gymnastics and Skate Canada, are aspiring to be best practice organizations, because they're committed to doing the work. So what does that mean in terms of the kinds of things that they've done? And this is with the Sport Inclusion Task Force. And so again, you've got Dr. William Bradell there, who's leading the Skate Canada. So an excellent resource for that. So staff training. So was asked to come in and do a full day of mandatory staff training for Skate Canada. So the CEO was there herself and said, "This is important. We need to do this." Supported it and attended the whole day. And Gymnastics Canada were doing the same thing. The second thing that the organizations are committed to doing is developing a policy, but also an action plan that's based on the experiences of their members, right? So who identifies LGBTQI2S, and so that means going out and talking to those members and finding out what those experiences are, and it could be, conversations. In our particular case with gymnastics, we're doing interviews, and we have to be very careful how we do that, because an athlete may not be out, but or they may not be out widely out. So certainly there's maybe some challenges around that. But most of you know either individuals that are out in your sport, you can have that conversation. So having conversations formally or informally to find out their experiences, and then actually saying, well, what are we going to do about that? What how are we going to make our sport more inclusive? Well, what are some things we can do? Well, we can start with the policy. We can start um, reviewing using that checklist we've developed that sort of takes a look, and again, I'm happy to share that as a resource that the Sport Inclusion Task Force has. This is how are we doing? Do we have a trans inclusion policy? Do we have this? Do we have that? So those are sort of steps that you can take. And then I think the other thing is educating your coaches, right? So making staff and coaches all take part in the COC introduction to LGBTQI2S inclusion in sport. Um, Asking and having role playing with your coaches when you're hiring them, if you're paid coaches. So what would you do if an athlete came out to you? And asking those kinds of questions. So it becomes part of that when you're hiring people. These are all best practices. Having a statement in there that says, organization is, you know, is an inclusive organization and welcomes applications from those of both all genders. Don't say both genders, but all genders. Sexual orientations, ethnicities, that kind of thing. So again, those are really good practices that an organization can look at to put in place. But it all starts with the conversation at the board level and the commitment to doing so.
Great. Um, we got a question online, and then we have another one in the room. So it's great discussion so far. Thank you so much. This question is from Denise. Are there resources available to speak about LGBTQI2S inclusion to athletes of different ages to have inclusion become a part of our organization's culture? What is the best approach to use in environments with mixed ages to help them understand how to respect differences? Is it preferred to separate discussions by ages to facilitate the use of age appropriate language? So I think she's great question. I think it speaks to different age categories and to have that conversation.
Right.
This is the
And
complexity.
so there I mean, just like we have different levels of health education in schools. I won't say sex education anymore, but health education in school. So should you have age appropriate conversations. So one of the things that you earlier and earlier, we are being having children and youth identify as gender fluid or in a different gender than what their biological sex is. So certainly when we talk about gender, we need to be doing that at an early age. Gender identity becomes apparent as early as age 3. So genders early in the conversation, and all genders, and so that's appropriate certainly for that. um Sexual orientation is something that becomes more apparent, as part of that maturation and puberty, going through puberty, where both heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals, become more aware of their sexual orientation. And so at those particular points in time, it's appropriate to have those conversations around, regardless of sexual orientation. Now, there's lots of opportunities to have that earlier if there's an issue. So, for example, let's say a 10-year-old is using a homophobic, saying faggot, right? Calling a teammate a faggot. Well, that's an a point. Do you talk about sexual orientation? You may not choose to do that, but you may say that's a really disrespectful term. And I'm and that's not a term you can use here, as part of this team. So and then if the athlete says, well, why is it disrespectful? Then you have to decide whether or not you're going to talk about, well, for someone That's a derogatory term that is used to call into question someone's masculinity. You don't have to say, well, that's a term that's used with someone, but you can talk about it without getting into sexual orientation. Now, if a 15 or 16-year-old uses that term, they know full well that faggot is a term used for or dyke is used as a derogatory term based on sexual orientation. So that's the conversation to have there.
Okay. Question in the room again?
Do you have any tips or techniques for evaluating the current level of inclusion that our organizations have, or just sort of for us to look at, the level of inclusion that's there, or even once we get these policies in place, just to see how effective that ends up being at the ground level of if athletes do feel included without being too sort of buzzwordy or get them thinking about things that they might not have even been thinking about because they didn't feel included.
So what I would say to the organization, one, Aaron, remind me to send you the draft, a checklist we've developed for work with the NSOs.
Absolutely.
It's a thing that we shared at the Sport Leadership Conference at the workshop 2 years ago, and so it's a work in progress. But at least you can sort of take a look at it and say, oh, okay, how are we doing as an organization? So it's not specific to national sport organizations. But I would say to you as an organization, how many out members do you have? Do you have staff? Do you have athletes? Do you have coaches? Do you have officials that are publicly out? And if you know your sport well at the provincial level, and you think, I can't think of one, then that tells you something. The other thing is that maybe you have a couple of out members. You could go and talk to them and say, so what's it like? And I'm assuming we have more LGBTQI2S members. Can you give us a sense of how we're doing on that? And that's where you'll really get that sense. But there is no sort of checklist to sort of say we're doing well or not doing well.
Okay, thanks. One more question online, and then we'll go back to Dave in the room. So, do you know of any documents that help the inclusion conversation around a religious sport group? I found it difficult to find supporting documents as soon as religion is brought into the picture.
So I think that they are still online, but Google Pat Griffin, Chalk Talk, religion. And Pat Griffin is a wonderful professor and LGBTQI2 activist and educator from the U.S. And as you can imagine, there's been some interesting conversations with colleges in the NCAA and in religious areas around homophobia. And religion being used as the basis for justifying discrimination. So what I would say to you is that just as we don't discriminate against anyone participating on the basis of their religious beliefs, we would not discriminate against anyone on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And if you have a parent who feels strongly about that and says, well, I'm not comfortable with having a man or a woman or a young boy or a young girl on the team that is, either identifies as lesbian or gender fluid or trans. The conversation is not, oh, how can we accommodate this religious viewpoint? It's saying, well, our team is accepting of all of our players, and regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and just as we wouldn't discriminate against your child based on your religious affiliation, nor would we do that. So then the conversation turns, then the choice is left with the parent. So if they are not comfortable with that, then they will, take their child from that team. But you don't say, well, yes, well, it's too bad, that's, well, we can't do anything about it. And it's not, no, this is, your religious views are fine, but they do not come into play when we are playing our sport. And if you turn the tables on it, give them sort of the reverse scenario, it should help them understand it. But at the end of the day, there are still, you know, um, certainly parents, less so if their children are being brought up in the public education system here in Canada, but some newcomers and others who have religious and strong cultural objections that still exists, sadly. So as an ally and as a leader, you want to make sure that you are not condoning or encouraging those viewpoints as being acceptable grounds for discrimination against members within your organization. They may be uncomfortable because your coach, they think your coach is gay, and so that's the same conversation. Well, their sexual orientation has nothing to do with their performance. Their sexual orientation has nothing to do with their being a member of the team. And so Pat Griffin's Chalk Talk and she's done some additional work around that, and has tried to have conversations with Christian colleges, if you can believe that, to find some common ground, so to be able to move forward on this. So kudos to her, because those are hard conversations to have.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, Jennifer, just a little bit back to that team level conversations, and it may help. I'll spit this out. When we're talking about inclusion and the human rights case in Ontario, the hockey one, right? You're familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
I am.
So let's say we want to be, and we want to be inclusive, and
Right.
we include a person that identifies, and in that case identifies as male. Let's take Ringette, and this is sort of a real situation for us. Is somebody that identifies as female, but we want to be inclusive, and that person identifies as female, so they're on the female team. But parents have their shorts in and out because they don't want their daughter in a dressing room with somebody that has boy parts. How do we manage that? Do we say, okay, we can accommodate you in another dressing room, and if enough people feel the same way, we've suddenly now marginalized that first person that we are now including on the team? How do we deal with that?
Well, it's really important that you come at it from a human rights perspective, because the human rights policies in Alberta and in all the provinces are really clear on this. Someone's discomfort with an individual's gender identity or sexual orientation is not sufficient grounds for that individual to be discriminated against.
Yeah, I don't think it's that. It's literally boy parts in a dressing room that has girl parts.
So
as
per the absolutely, as per, but my first response remains the response. As per the human rights policy, in that particular situation, you would be interested in what the individual who identifies as trans is most comfortable with. You would be having that conversation with that individual, not the the parent of the child who says their child is uncomfortable. And you find out what works for that trans individual, and then saying, okay, how are we going to work this through? So let's say the individual is trans and says, well, I want to be in the dressing room with my my other teammates, and that's my choice, right? So then if people are uncomfortable with that, right? So you've asked the individual who is from the minority group what they are comfortable with. If for any reason there is a parent or an other athlete who is uncomfortable with that, that's the conversation you have to have with them. So in that particular case, you need to have the conversation, why are you uncomfortable, right? and because they are uncomfortable, because they are uneducated and still view that hockey player or that swimmer or that volleyball player as in the other gender. So they still see them as a boy in a girl's dressing room or a girl in a boy's dressing room. And so the conversation to have is that individual identifies as a female and wants to be in the dressing room with the other athletes, and so that's what we're. If your daughter, so here's, if your daughter is not comfortable with that, then we can find another change room for her to change into. See the difference? So, but what you don't want to have is the whole team then going off to another change room, and this potential athlete now in the change room on her own. So you have to manage that dynamic. You have to have those difficult conversations, because there is a lot of misinformation and myths around this stuff. So they are hard conversations to have potentially, but they're usually as a result of parents feeling strongly. If you know the other thing is that you're dealing with that athlete's parents. So let's say you have a trans athlete, and you've got to deal with their minors with their parents too. So those are all conversations you're having, the daughter, the mom and the dad. So tough conversations, absolutely, but important conversations.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that last part because the the athlete is parents don't support her decision,
Hmm.
and so we can't even have that conversation with them.
Yes, so I mean, there you have another challenge, right? So you have an athlete who is identifying as, you know, um, gender fluid, or wanting to transition, or gender identifying in the other gender, and parents who aren't supportive of that. So and you're trying to navigate that. I know it's not easy, but it's, again, think of it as what's best for the athlete in terms of helping them, and helping the team to understand that it's an important part of being a team is respecting differences. And it's more about you know how good that player is and how well they are around that team, and what contribution they make, than focusing on their gender identity. And coming back to what's important about sport is, we're there to play a game. We're there to do this. Uh, that's the commonality. So if you can bring it back to that, and focus on that, I think that's really helpful.
Great. We have 5 minutes left, so if there's any other questions, please put it into the chat box. I guess I have some questions around the Sport Inclusion Task Force. I thought this was great. Action steps from the webinar. Has there been any discussion about setting up inclusion task forces regionally, like provincially? Is that something that would be an outcome of the SITF?
Well, I would love to think that that's happening, but the SITF was put in place to, well, one, we have no funding. So no, we have no money. So all of us are doing this sort of as a result of being with other organizations, and it's sort of off the, so that in itself poses a challenge, but we're doing it because we just think there's a need for a coordinating function. And so that you can play is doing work. So I can be aware of that and say, well, look, there's a great organization, because cause isn't local or regional, but you can play has a regional Western affiliation. So great, they're doing work out there, or back east here, or cause is doing some work in that area. COC, egal Canada. So that was the intent of doing that, and then we wanted to address some gaps. So um, the SITF is a good regional organization. What I would say is it might be beneficial, and again, and Alberta Sport Connections may want to look at this as sort of something that they can facilitate and support. Is the coming together of You Can Play and other organizations that are doing work provincially. So the equivalent of an EGAL Canada, in Alberta, and maybe some local organizations who are doing good work with youth. So that would be sort of the equivalent of the SITF locally or provincially. And if there's an interest and a will, we've got the COC supporting our calls on a monthly basis, that kind of thing. A website. It's not onerous in terms of support, but it just requires some resources, not necessarily dollars.
Jody, the SITF stands for the Sport Inclusion Task Force. So certainly lots of work to do in that regard in Alberta for sure. I know our sport development team has identified this as certainly a priority and looking how we build this out. So awesome. So
what I would say is that. Sorry, just jump in here. I mean, if one of the things that Alberta, you do have Chris Wells as well at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Diversity, and he is a incredibly well respected researcher and educator on sexual and gender identities, and so he was helped to craft the Alberta Schools Athletic Association and the Alberta Education Policy on trans inclusion and inclusion of sexual and gender minorities in sport. So again, you've got your Alberta policy in place that basically says, an individual can play on an interscholastic team up to and including provincial championships in the gender in which they identify. And so they've, again, Chris would be an excellent resource to talk about. I asked Chris the other day, I said, have you had any, challenges with implementing the policy? And he said, none. Surprisingly so. There was lots of noise before when it was announced, but it's been quite good. So again, a good local resource to tap into, and already a best model practice model to follow.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Well, I think our time is up. I just want to say again, thank you for your time for us today. This has been tremendous. And just from all of us and people that can't come here, the comment was that just thank you for your leadership within this space in Canada. It's very much appreciated.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity, and for all of you that are here today and are accessing the information afterwards. It's so important to have allies in this field, and so the conversations that you have, although they may be challenging, they get easier, and usually and your LGBTQI2S athletes, coaches, staff, can't thank you enough. It makes a tremendous difference.
Great. And just a closing comment from Leah Weens. Thank you to Jennifer for a great conversation. My 18-year-old son, a hockey player, was listening, and we ended up having a really good side conversation. So excellent. I will just an announcement that so going forward, CSI Calgary has offered their space to host the remaining LTAD lunches at the CSI boardroom for the remaining of the year. So thank you to Jason Sostrom. And so if you're in the Calgary area, make your way over to Winsport for the rest of the sessions. Moving to next month, we have Meredith Gardner, formerly of Freestyle Canada. She now is with Count Me In. Count Me In is an organization that helps out inclusion regarding invisible disabilities. So those would be things like autism or other cognitive disabilities, and how we create inclusive spaces for those members. So I'm looking forward to next week. So please join us. So again, Jennifer, I will look forward to those resources, and I'll pass them along, and I will post the recording on the website and those resources. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Leah's son's 18. I still remember Steve Norris talking